Medieval war wagons were basically tanks, not because they were fast, but because they gave soldiers mobile protection, a stable firing platform, and a way to stop a cavalry charge cold. Picture a line of heavy wooden wagons chained wheel to wheel, turning an open field into an instant fortress, with crossbows and early guns firing from behind cover. In the next few minutes, you'll see how these wagon forts worked, why knights struggled against them, and how medieval armies accidentally invented a kind of armored warfare centuries before actual tanks showed up. Number 1. The open field problem. Medieval armies had a simple problem that decided a lot of fights. Moving across open ground was dangerous. If you were on foot, you were exposed to arrows, bolts, stones, and later gunpowder shots. If you were on a horse, you were faster, but you were also a big target, and your horse could be stopped by anything that broke the charge. Commanders knew that a clean, full-speed cavalry charge could smash an unprepared line, especially if that line had no cover and no time to form up. The flip side is that cavalry needs space, momentum, and confidence. Take away any one of those, and the unstoppable charge becomes a crowded mess of horses slowing down, turning sideways, and bunching up while riders try to keep control. That's where war wagons come in. A wagon isn't just a cart. On a battlefield, a wagon is instant cover. It's a moving wall that you can bring with you, park where you want, and build a whole fighting position around. You can hide behind it, rest weapons on it, reload behind it, and use it to break the enemy's rhythm. And because it's a vehicle, it also carries the stuff that keeps an army alive: food, tools, spare strings for crossbows, extra arrows and bolts, powder, shot, water, rope, nails, axes, and repair gear. So when people say medieval war wagons were basically tanks, they're not saying they were fast or unstoppable.
They're saying they solved the same 3 battlefield problems tanks solve: protection for the crew, mobility for that protection, and a platform for weapons. Once you see medieval warfare as a constant fight over space and momentum, the wagon starts looking less like baggage and more like armored doctrine in wooden form. And that leads straight into how these wagons were built and used. Number 2. The wagon as armor. A medieval war wagon usually started as something ordinary, the same kind of heavy wagon used to haul grain, barrels, and supplies. Armies already had lots of them because logistics mattered even then. The war part came from modifications, and most of them were practical rather than fancy. The sides could be built up with thick planks to create a chest-high wall. Extra boards could be added to raise the profile and protect standing men, and some wagons added a simple step or bench inside so shooters could fire over the edge, then drop down again. Many wagons used iron fittings, reinforced corners, and stronger braces, mostly to stop the frame from twisting when the wagon was dragged into position and then hit by men, horses, and missiles. You sometimes see metal plates or rawhide layers in key spots, not as full steel armor, but as toughened surfaces that were harder to split and slower to burn. Shooting gaps could be cut into the sides so crossbowmen or early gunners could fire without exposing their whole body. Some wagons carried big, portable shields called pavises that could be set between wagons or hung on them to close gaps. If the wagon had a canvas cover for travel, that cover could be removed before battle to reduce fire risk and open the space for fighters. A wagon's wheels and axle weren't glamorous, but they were part of the armor idea too. A broken wheel means a dead position, so crews carried wedges, ropes, spare spokes, grease, and tools, and they picked routes that wouldn't wreck the wagon before the fight even started. Horses were common for speed, oxen for steady pulling power.
and the choice depended on local economy and terrain. The key point is that a war wagon wasn't a single standard design. It was a category, a heavy vehicle turned into a fighting platform. Some were tall and boxy, some lower and sturdier. Some had a small swivel gun or light cannon mounted to fire forward or sideways. Others were basically mobile barricades supporting infantry. The common thread is that the wagon gives you a protected, stable base that you can link with other wagons to create something much bigger than one cart. That linking is where it stops being equipment and becomes a system. Number 3. Crew roles. If you picture a war wagon like a medieval tank, the crew roles suddenly make sense. Somebody has to drive, meaning handle the team, manage speed, and keep the wagon from tipping or bogging down. Somebody has to keep the wagon in fighting shape, meaning ropes tight, wheels checked, and the wagon positioned exactly where the commander wants it. Then you need the weapons crew. A typical war wagon in 15th century Central Europe could carry a mix of fighters rather than one type. You might have crossbowmen for accurate shots, early handgunners for armor-piercing punch at short range, and men with polearms for anyone who got close. You also needed shieldmen to cover reloading, because early firearms were slow and crossbows took time too. Some firearms were designed to be used from cover, like hook guns with a metal hook that could brace on the wagon edge so recoil didn't throw the shooter backward. So the wagon worked like a small team with layers. Ranged weapons hit the enemy while they approach, then long weapons stop them if they reach the line, and short weapons finish the job if there's a breach. This is why training mattered. It's not enough to own wagons. You need crews who know their timing. When do you fire? When do you hold? When do you reload?
When do you open a gap for a counterattack? And when do you keep the wall sealed? The wagon crew also had to be disciplined about space. Wagons are crowded. You're working around wood, ropes, animals, ammo, and other people. If everyone panics, you block each other, and then the armored position turns into a trap. The best wagon forces solved that with simple routines and clear roles, and they used signals so crews could react together. Even the way ammunition was stored mattered. Powder needed to stay dry, bolts had to be reachable, and everything had to move quickly without exposing people. In other words, these wagons weren't just gear, they were organization. And once you have organized wagon teams, the next step is obvious. You don't leave them as separate units. You connect them, and you build a battlefield shape. Number 4. Building a wagenburg. The classic tactic is the wagon fort, often called a wagenburg, basically a wagon castle. The idea is straightforward. Park wagons in a line, a square, a circle, or a rough rectangle, then lock them together so the enemy can't simply push one aside. Chains, ropes, and beams could link wheels and axles. In some setups, wagons were staggered so the joints didn't line up in one weak seam, a bit like overlapping boards in a wall. Gaps between wagons were the danger, so crews filled them with shields, planks, stakes, or even short fences made from spare timber. If the ground allowed it, they'd dig shallow trenches in front of the line or scrape away turf to make a slippery, uneven approach. Choosing the spot mattered. A wagon fort works best when it sits on ground that slows the enemy and protects your flanks, like a gentle slope, a stream edge, a marshy patch, or even a road choke point. The fort didn't have to be perfect. It had to deny a clean charge and buy time for ranged weapons to work. Inside the wagon ring, you could keep spare horses, wounded men, ammunition, and commanders.
That internal space is a big reason the tank comparison works. It's not just a wall, It's a protected operating area. Another important detail is firing angles. A wagon fort can create crossfire. If the enemy hits one face of the formation, wagons on the corners can shoot along the line, hitting attackers from the side where shields and armor are weaker and where horses don't like to be. A good commander also thought about exits. You don't want a fort that you can't leave. So, wagon formations often had controlled gaps that could be opened for a sally, then closed again with a spare wagon, a beam, or a line of shields. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the tactic. It's not sit and hope. It's absorb the hit, break the attack's shape, then respond. In practice, the wagon fort acted like a temporary base that could appear on the battlefield in hours rather than days. Building a stone castle takes years. Building a wagon castle takes planning and discipline. And that speed made it a game changer in campaigns where armies moved fast and fought often. Number 5. Firepower from cover. Protection is only half the story. The other half is what the wagon lets you do with weapons. On open ground, archers and crossbowmen can shoot, but they're also exposed to return fire and cavalry. Behind a wagon wall, they can take shots, step back to reload, and step forward again. That alone boosts effectiveness, because medieval ranged weapons reward calm and repetition. Crossbows especially are powerful and accurate, but slower than bows, and reloading with a belt hook, a lever, or a windlass takes time. The wagon gives you that time and a stable rest for aiming. Early handguns and hand cannons were even slower, and they were awkward to handle, smoky and loud. But they had a key advantage. At close range, a lead ball could punch through armor that would shrug off many arrows. War wagons turned early firearms from a risky novelty into something you could build tactics around, because the wagon reduces the shooter's exposure and helps manage the confusion of smoke and noise. That's also why you see so many early firearms used like wall guns, fired from behind cover, not out in the open. Some wagons carried small artillery pieces too. Think light cannons for field use, not the huge siege guns used against castles. Mounted on a wagon or placed between wagons, these guns could disrupt formations and scare horses long before a melee started. There were even multi-barrel organ-style guns in some armies, useful for putting several shots into a narrow approach. The real effect of wagon firepower was combined. Crossbows for steady hits, handguns for shock and armor penetration, and small artillery for disruption. None of these weapons alone were magic. Together, and used from behind cover, they created a kill zone that punished an enemy for doing the most medieval thing possible, charging forward in tight formation. If you try to ride through that, you lose momentum, you lose horses, and you lose the clean timing that makes heavy cavalry scary. That pressure changes the whole battle, because once the charge fails, elite cavalry are often forced to dismount and fight as infantry, and the fight becomes a close grind. Exactly the kind of fight wagon crews were set up to handle. Number 6. Stopping a charge. People sometimes imagine knights as unstoppable, but medieval commanders were always looking for ways to stop cavalry, because everyone understood the threat. The usual answers were terrain, long spears, and solid infantry discipline. War wagons combined all three in one package. First, they shape the terrain. A line of wagons is an obstacle you can't ignore. Horses don't like crashing into solid objects, and riders don't want to gamble their life on whether the wagon line breaks. Second, wagons let infantry use long weapons safely. A man with a pike, spear, or halberd is dangerous if he can keep his balance and keep his line. The wagon wall gives him something to brace against and a place to retreat half a step without the whole formation collapsing. Third, wagons support discipline.
It's easier to hold your place when you're not standing alone in an open field, and you know you have cover right behind you. Add a few more medieval tricks, and the tank feel gets stronger. Crews could place stakes, caltrops, or other small obstacles in front of the wagons to force horses to slow down or veer away. They could dig shallow ditches that were easy to miss at speed. They could stretch chains between wagons at ankle height, turning the space into a hazard for legs and hooves. And because wagons could produce crossfire, any rider who tries to skirt the line risks being hit from the side. All of that means the cavalry charge stops being a simple forward motion. It turns into a problem-solving exercise under fire, and that's exactly what cavalry doesn't want. Heavy cavalry works best when it can choose the moment and commit fully. Wagon warfare takes that choice away. It forces cavalry to either dismount and assault like infantry, which removes their biggest advantage, or to pull back and look for another angle, which costs time and morale. In medieval warfare, morale is often the hidden weapon. When a proud, expensive cavalry force sees that its best move isn't working, the whole army starts doubting the plan. That's why war wagons weren't just physical protection. They were psychological armor. Number 7. A moving fort and supply base. If war wagons were only defensive walls, they would be interesting but limited. The bigger point is that wagons are already part of an army's movement. Every medieval army had a baggage train. Food, tents, tools, spare weapons, and the money chest all traveled on wagons.
What the best wagon armies did was flip the logic. Instead of treating wagons as a vulnerable tail that needs protection, they treated wagons as the protection. When the army stopped, the wagons became the camp's walls. When the army fought, the wagons became the front line. That changes campaign behavior. You can move through hostile territory with more confidence because you can bring your fort to the next stop. You can choose a battlefield and quickly make it hard for the enemy to exploit you. You can also protect your supplies better, which means you can stay in the field longer and worry less about being cut off. In modern terms, that's operational freedom. There's also a command benefit. Wagon forts create a stable center where leaders can communicate, keep reserves, manage prisoners, and control retreat routes. Medieval battles often fell apart because commanders lost control once lines collided. A wagon base gives you a way to keep some structure even when the edges are chaotic. Now, the tank comparison has limits. A tank is armored and can fight while moving, and it can cross rough ground in ways a wagon can't. A wagon fort fights best when parked and prepared. But the shared idea is mobile protection supporting firepower and organization. You don't need to pretend wagons were fast to see that they were doing a similar job for their era, letting relatively vulnerable troops hold ground against elite shock forces, and letting an army keep its combat power tied to its supplies instead of constantly worrying about being raided. That's also why war wagons show up most clearly in places and times where armies were more mixed, like town militia, peasant infantry, and hired soldiers, because wagons help those troops fight above their weight. Number 8. The Hussite system. The most famous war wagon story comes from the Hussite Wars in early 15th century Bohemia. The Hussites were fighting against multiple crusading armies and local rivals, and they didn't always have the same kind of heavy cavalry resources their opponents had. What they did have was a population used to wagons for trade and farming, plus a strong motivation to innovate. Under leaders like Jan Žižka,
They didn't just use wagons for cover, they built a method. Wagons were organized into units, crews were trained, and the army practiced setting up wagon forts quickly, even under pressure. They also leaned into firearms earlier than many of their enemies, not because firearms were perfect, but because behind wagons, even clumsy early guns become useful. In battles in the 1420s, including fights near Prague and in the South Bohemian countryside, wagon lines absorbed cavalry attacks that would normally roll over militia, and then the Hussites counterattacked when the enemy was disorganized. That counterattack part matters. The wagon fort was the anvil. The hammer could be infantry rushing out with polearms, or mounted troops hitting a weakened side, or just sustained fire forcing a retreat. Zhishka is also associated with using wagon formations not only to hold ground, but to move in a protected column and then deploy into a fort when contact was expected. It's not a tank charge, but it is a way to keep an army together while moving through threat areas, which is exactly the point of armored thinking. The system also scaled. A small force could make a tight ring of wagons. A large force could make layered lines, with wagons in front, infantry behind, and reserves inside. Their enemies learned fast that charging straight at a prepared wagon line was a bad deal. So opponents tried artillery, flanking, surprise attacks, and cutting supplies. That pushed the Hussites to keep improving, adding more field guns, using scouts, and choosing terrain carefully.
When you look at this whole cycle, measure and countermeasure, you're basically watching a medieval version of doctrine development. The materials are different, but the logic is familiar. Protection enables firepower. Firepower shapes enemy behavior, and then both sides adjust until the advantage shrinks or a new idea shows up. Number 9. Weak spots and counters. War wagons weren't a cheat code. They were strong under the right conditions and weak under the wrong ones. Terrain is the first limiter. Wagons hate deep mud, steep slopes, thick forests, and broken ground. If you can't get the wagons into position, you can't use the tactic. Speed is another limiter. A wagon army can move, but it usually can't sprint. If a faster enemy can choose when and where to fight, the wagon side may be forced into bad ground or forced to deploy too early, losing surprise and flexibility. Fire is a classic threat. Wood burns, and medieval armies had plenty of ways to start fires, from burning arrows to pitch and bundles of brush. Wagon crews countered this with wet hides, careful spacing, and aggressive defense of the front, but the risk never goes away. Artillery is the most direct counter. Even light field guns can crack planks, smash wheels, and create gaps that cavalry or infantry can exploit. As gunpowder weapons improved and armies got better at deploying artillery in the field, wagon forts became less dominant. Coordination is another weakness. A wagon fort only works if the wagons stay linked and the crews keep their roles. If panic spreads, if a driver pulls away too early, or if the line opens by accident, the formation can unravel fast. And if the enemy gets inside the wagon ring, the same walls that protected you can box you in. So good opponents focused on creating one point of failure: a broken corner, a burning wagon, a gap at a ditch, anything that forces the defenders to react in a hurry. Once defenders start moving pieces around under pressure, the clean firing lanes disappear and the advantage drops. That's why experienced wagon commanders put effort into scouting, controlling approaches, and keeping reserves ready to plug gaps. They didn't want a fair fight. They wanted a fight where the enemy had to attack into prepared obstacles. In that sense, the wagon fort is like a fortress. Powerful, but it asks you
to think ahead. Number 10. Legacy. After the Middle Ages. Even when the classic Hussite moment passed, the idea didn't disappear. Using vehicles to build instant fortifications shows up again and again, especially anywhere armies had big baggage trains and had to worry about raids. In Central and Eastern Europe, you see Tabor-style camps, where wagons form a defensive ring for troops and supplies on the move. In the late medieval and early modern period, border wars and steppe frontier fighting kept that habit alive because cavalry-heavy opponents could appear fast, and a wagon ring gave you a safe place to regroup. In Western Europe, disciplined infantry formations and field fortifications made from earth and timber gradually took over more of the anti-cavalry job, and artillery made wooden barriers easier to break. But wagons still mattered for camp defense and for protecting the army's core resources. What war wagons really demonstrate is how quickly a battlefield changes when you can create cover on demand. If you can park your transport, turn it into a wall, and mount weapons behind it, you can let less armored troops survive contact with elite shock forces. You can keep your supplies closer to the fight, and you can make the enemy work harder for every meter of ground. As gunpowder weapons spread and armies became more professional, the same basic goal was met with different tools. But the wagon fort idea kept resurfacing wherever armies had wagons, needed quick cover, and had to deal with sudden attacks.